So just as a reminder, these are the 5 key characteristics. That's going to be scalability, automation, data quality, simplicity, and cost savings. And so we'll talk a little bit about how our solution tackles each one of those, with the cost savings sort of already being spoken about, especially when you relay them to the other 4 characteristics. So before we jump into the actual real-world project, I wanted to summarize the issue that the client came to us with and what they wanted us to address, right? So this particular company came to us with a problem, which was a very much a scaling and cost related problem, right? They were having trouble scaling up properly to meet all of the demand that they were getting. They had plenty of clients, which is a good problem to have. They had plenty of clients waiting to onboard and use their system, but they just could not onboard them quickly enough. The lead time was extremely long, and the development for each particular client was also very long, in part because each one had its own variation and uniqueness, right? They wanted to send the data in a slightly different way, and they wanted to receive the data as well in a slightly different way. So this made costs for onboarding astronomical and made the ROI much longer as far as how quickly they would be able to recover the onboarding costs with their subscription. So what we did was we took a look at their problem and decided to turn CloverDX on and leverage CloverDX to look for a solution to their particular problem. So with that being said, a little bit of introduction into CloverDX. CloverDX is a data integration platform. So it's going to really help you drive a lot of different solutions within your data environment. It's going to help you automate the data and workloads. And that's automation from the very beginning, from the source system all the way to the target. It's also going to give you one place to solve all of your data processing tasks. And so it's going to allow you to do mundane tasks fairly quickly and efficiently, but also give you the configurability to handle all of the complexities that we see in a real live data environment. And then finally, it's going to increase productivity and trust. So it's always going to have some logging and data validation capabilities. It's going to allow you to sort of automate these things. So that way you can, sort of increase productivity and reuse some of your data pipelines for multiple different workflows. That being said, when we take a deeper dive into the solution that the client was looking for us to solve, this is their overall data environment, right? You can see CloverDX Server sits in the middle where it does all of the data processing. But we also have a couple of different source systems, right? We're going to have a source system, in this case, an Amazon S3 bucket, where we have configuration for each of the clients, right? And that's really going to drive all of the sort of uniqueness behind each one of the clients. Then we're going to actually have the data that comes in via SFTP server. And we're going to also have a code base where we sort of store all of the logic that we create within CloverDX. And then as far as targets go, we also have a target SFTP server and an email server where we send off reports and alerts. So in this particular real world example, right, we're helping them create a data ingestion framework. And so you can see here that we have a whole host of different processes that we run through. That's going to be staging the data, pre-processing, validating, post-processing, and actually delivering the data. Now, what's unique about our solution is that each one of these is driven by the configuration, right? So each one is going to be slightly varied depending on what client it is and depending on what configuration file we feed to it. And of course, along all of these steps, we're going to do some advanced logging and make sure that we are alerting proper people to any issues, or even alerting people whenever there are no issues, just to give them that confidence that things went as expected. Now, if you don't mind, I will switch into CloverDX CloverDX, and we can take a look at what it takes to design one of these data pipelines and what that looks like in the real world. So here I switched over to CloverDX Designer. As you'd expect, this is where you design your various data pipelines, test them out, and ensure that they work as expected. And then once you're satisfied with them, you can deploy them to server and have them actually be automated and monitored on a real-time basis. So in this particular data example, you can see that we're doing a host of different things, right? Each one of these components there does one or more things to the data that's coming in and kind of prepares it for the next step until we finally get to the very end and actually write out the data to the target system. But first, the first thing we do is we get some input, right? And this is going to be driven by that configuration. And that configuration is going to be very easy to modify. It's going to be easy to add new configurations for when a client gets onboarded. So that way, instead of developers coming in here and modifying this data pipeline for each and every individual client that gets onboarded, you simply create a new configuration file. And that configuration file then gets uploaded to S3 bucket and then gets pulled in. And so we know how to process each and every individual client's data with all of its uniqueness. So as you can see here, we talked about some of the steps, right? Data staging is here, for example. And that's literally just going to involve staging all of the data, staging the configuration, and getting that ready. Then we have some pre-processing, the main one being whether or not it's zipped. So if it's zipped, we're going to unzip it. If not, we're going to kind of keep processing. The other big thing is validation, right? So you can see here that we have metadata and field validation. So this is where we're going to check to make sure that the data columns match our expectations and that the file overall looks as we expect. Then we're going to run some pre-processing. And of course, that pre-processing is going to vary depending on what client we're talking about and what their particular use case and requirements are. Finally, we're going to do some field validations again, just to ensure that the pre-processing went as we'd expect. So we do a little bit of validation there as well. And then we run some post-processing, get the data ready for the actual output target location. And that might oftentimes involve zipping the files back up. And then we're going to actually load to the target system, right? So that's where we actually load all the information to the target system. And then we will archive all of the files that we received. So that way we have a record of them. Now, another important thing to keep in mind is that all of these this entire workflow, while fairly complex and with a lot of different components, each one of these components has its own subset of sort of validations and modifications that they make to the data. And so it really allows you, even though this is a very complicated workflow, to understand what's happening at each and every individual step. So all of the staging steps are kind of grouped together, all of the validation steps, all of the pre-processing steps are kind of grouped together. So that way it's very easy to follow the workflow all the way through. And another thing I'll point out is you'll notice that a lot of these components have secondary edges. And along these secondary edges, we're simply gathering all the information from each one of these processes and then writing it out to an execution log, right? So we can write information out to the execution and integration logs. That way the client knows, hey, you know, this process ran X number of times on this particular day. It processed this many records and inserted this much data and get all the metrics that they're looking for. So we gather all that information from each one of the steps. And if there are any errors, we gather those errors as well and mark that as a failure. So this way you can ensure that, you know, you can follow the workflow and understand the data processing in a very simple and easy to use way. You can scale it up by using that configuration driven processing. And then you can get that data quality notification letting you know that, hey, the data is as expected. And if not, you know, who are we going to notify? The other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is automation, right? So once we're happy with this particular data pipeline, that's when we'll be able to actually deploy it into our server environment and automate it and monitor it. So if I switch my screen over here to CloverDX Server, you can see Server. One of the things it does, which is nice, is gives you a nice little GUI. You can come in here and log in. And you'll be greeted with a dashboard letting you know the status of the particular job at a high level, right? So each one of these involves multiple different pipelines, and you can group them together. If there are any issues, you'd be notified about them right away. And then the other thing that Server is really good for is automating things, right? So you have schedule-based, event-based, and data services, right? Schedule is going to be pretty straightforward, right? You want to create a schedule that runs a particular data pipeline every 5 minutes and runs another data pipeline at the end of the week on a Sunday. You know, you can schedule those out accordingly. Event listening is going to allow you to listen into your data environment. So that might involve things like message queue, listening in for particular messages, or it might involve a file being dropped, like in an SFTP location or something like that. And once those files come in, then we would sort of kick off those data processing jobs. And then finally, data services allows you to work with APIs. So that way you can invoke these data jobs and these data processes through third-party applications and then process accordingly. We can even take those APIs and turn them into a web form, so that way users can run their own reports and configure different parameters and things like that for when they run the reports. So that way your development time is more used for developing instead of modifying individual runs or reports.